Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. I am Millie Chandler. I am a senior planner with Maricopa County Air Quality Department in the analysis unit. And as Anne said, I'm going to be reviewing what was done for the Maricopa County 2020 Community Greenhouse Gas Emissions Inventory, as well as giving a brief update on the progress for the Pinal County Greenhouse Gas Emissions Inventory that we are conducting. A few years ago, Maricopa County Air Quality Department conducted the first countywide greenhouse gas emissions inventory for our area using countywide source category emissions data for the calendar year of 2018. This year, we're happy to present an update to this emissions inventory with an assessment of more current greenhouse gas emissions and an emissions trend analysis using emissions data for the calendar year of 2020. Total countywide emissions were allocated to each municipality and unincorporated areas to promote and assist in local greenhouse gas reduction initiatives. We are excited to provide this information for use by state, local, and municipal agencies, as well as NGOs and nonprofits in Arizona, for development and implementation of voluntary emission reduction programs, grant applications, intra-agency cooperation efforts for climate action planning, and more. The greenhouse gas emissions inventory is separated into 9 source categories that were used to conduct our emissions analysis. For mobile sources, the greenhouse gas emissions for motor vehicles and the airport sector of mobile source categories were provided by the Maricopa Association of Governments. MAG used the MOVES-3 and AEDT modeling software to evaluate emissions from personal vehicles, trucks, non-road vehicles, public transit, and airports. The EPA provided greenhouse gas emissions data for locomotives in Maricopa County from the calculations that they conducted for the National Emissions Inventory. It can be seen in the figure on the right that personal vehicles and trucks contributed 84% of the 21.5 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent greenhouse gas emissions estimated for the mobile source category in Maricopa County during 2020. Mobile source greenhouse gas emissions were allocated to municipalities and unincorporated areas, specifically using population proportions. Electricity use and sulfur hexafluoride data, excluding the sulfur hexafluoride usage for manufacturing purposes, was provided by the Arizona Public Service Company and the Salt River Project. This data was used to calculate greenhouse gas emissions by using the EPA 2020 E-Grid emissions factor for Southwest Regional Electric Grid, or using the sulfur hexafluoride emission conversion factor of 22,800 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per metric ton of sulfur hexafluoride. This provided us a total estimation of 19.1 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent greenhouse gas emissions calculated for the electricity use source category. Our calculations show that residential electricity use contributed 51%, or 9.7 million metric tons of emissions, followed by 39%, or 7.4 million metric tons of emissions contributed by the commercial and institutional sector, and the remaining 10%, or 2 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent greenhouse gas emissions were estimated to have come from the industrial sector in Maricopa County for 2020. Electricity usage was provided to Maricopa County by municipality and unincorporated areas, split up by APS and SRP when they provided the data. So no additional allocations were conducted for this particular source category. EPA tools developed for the 2020 National Emissions Inventory, including the Institutional, Commercial, and Industrial Combustion Tool, and the EPA residential heating tool were used to pull data for input into the EPA local greenhouse gas inventory tool for emissions calculations. Industrial, commercial, and institutional and residential usage of distillate oil fuel, natural gas, and propane were used to calculate emissions for this source category. As seen in the electricity use emissions, the residential sector was the largest emissions contributor at 1.2 million metric tons, or 43% of the total emissions for this category, followed by commercial at 1 million metric tons, or 37%, and rounded out through the industrial contribution of 560,000 metric tons, or 20% of the total emissions of 2.8 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent emissions for this source category. This source category was also allocated to the municipalities and unincorporated areas using population proportions. Wastewater treatment facilities were surveyed in Maricopa County for data regarding methane and nitrous oxide producing operations at their facilities. This data allowed us to calculate facility-specific greenhouse gas emissions while also providing us an estimation of the population served by septic systems within Maricopa County. The data that we pulled from these surveys was input into the local greenhouse gas inventory tool provided by the EPA, and a total of 1 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent greenhouse gas emissions were calculated for this source category. Wastewater emissions were also allocated to municipalities and unincorporated areas using population proportions. Because a more recent livestock census has not yet been published for Arizona, we did use the 2017 livestock census data for dairy and beef cattle in Maricopa County. This is a census published by the National Agricultural Statistics Survey, and the census data was evaluated using the updated methods provided by the International Panel on Climate Change Guidelines for national greenhouse gas inventories. This resulted in an estimation of 856,000 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent emissions for the source category in the year of 2020. Unlike previous source categories, emissions from livestock in Maricopa County were allocated to municipalities based on the proportion of land used for livestock operations and activities within the boundaries of each municipality rather than population proportion. Facilities that use fluorinated gases in their manufacturing processes report these emissions directly to the EPA facility level information on greenhouse gases tool, also known as the flight tool. This data was pulled for the 8 gases that you see in the table on the right-hand side of this slide, and a total contribution of 580,000 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent emissions were estimated for this source category. This data was pulled in the form of metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent emissions, so no additional calculations were conducted aside from municipality allocations, which were conducted based on population proportions for this particular category. Greenhouse gas emissions for landfills was also pulled from the EPA flight tool for the solid waste source category, with the exception of the City of Chandler landfill, which provided their information directly to us. This information was was used to estimate a total of 526,000 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent emissions for Maricopa County for the year of 2020, which is approximately 1% of our total greenhouse gas emissions countywide for the year of 2020. These emissions were also allocated to municipalities using population proportions. The Central Arizona project is dedicated to delivering Colorado River water to Maricopa, Pinal, and Pima counties in Arizona. And they were kind enough to provide us with direct data on the amount of water delivered to and through Maricopa County specifically, as well as the amount of electricity that was used for these deliveries, and the specific greenhouse gas emissions factor that they calculated for their very diverse power portfolio for the year of 2020. This data was used to calculate a total of 274,000 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent emissions for this particular source category. This source category was also allocated to municipalities by using population proportions. The 2020 farm and non-farm fertilizer use was extrapolated from a county-level nitrogen fertilizer use study from the U.S. Geologic Survey for 1950 to 2017. This information was used to conduct a linear regression analysis to determine the approximate nitrogen fertilizer use for the year of 2020 in Maricopa County, which was then input into the local greenhouse gas inventory tool to obtain a total emissions estimate of 150,000 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent greenhouse gas emissions. For emissions allocations in this source category, land use data from the Maricopa County Assessor's Office allowed for an allocation of fertilizer emissions specific to land use types within each municipality. These land use types include residential land, parkland, and golf courses. And the estimated land availability for fertilizer application based on those land types, as well as the rate of application per land type based on additional research, allowed for us to conduct specific weighted calculations for each emissions allocation specific to the land use within each municipality. Carbon sequestration values were obtained through the input of tree cover data obtained from the EPA Enviro Atlas to the EPA Local Greenhouse Gas Inventory Tool. As you can see in the picture on your screen, the tree cover data obtained from Maricopa County is primarily accounting for urban areas, but we are exploring additional methodology for expansion of our understanding of coverage throughout the more rural areas for additional updates that we would like to conduct within the future. A total of 275,000 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalents were estimated to have been reduced by the tree coverage that we have in Maricopa County. And we used the total area of tree coverage within each municipality's boundaries to determine how we allocated those emission reductions in our total allocation calculations. So for overall results on a countywide basis, a final estimation of all of the source categories shows a net greenhouse gas emission rate for Maricopa County in 2020 to be just under 46.6 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalents of greenhouse gas emissions. This does show an overall decrease of 2 million metric tons from the 2018 net greenhouse gas emissions estimate of 48.6 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalents. The largest contributing source categories are mobile sources and electricity use, which combined contribute emissions totaling 40.6 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalents, or 87% of the total emissions that were estimated for Maricopa County as a whole in the year of 2020. While there was an increase in emissions from 6 of the 9 source categories, we observed that these increases were not large enough to have caused a net increase in the countywide emissions. As I said earlier, we actually observed a net decrease in those emissions. This net decrease can be contributed to decreases in electricity use emissions, livestock emissions, and solid waste emissions that were calculated for the year of 2022 or 2020, I apologize. And it also is a result of an increase in the carbon sequestration estimated for 2020 through urban forestry. We do look forward to continuing this assessment and having a better idea of how these trends are going to continue in the future and how the different emissions programs that all of our fellow municipalities and local agencies use this information in the future and programs that they put together. This is what your individual municipal profiles will end up looking like. I have the example of Phoenix and Scottsdale on our presentation for you right now. They all come in this form so that they're easily accessible for you and for your constituents, and can be easily added into any presentations that you guys may have regarding this information. Access to the full report is available on our website. I have a link here that will be available to you when the presentation is provided to you, as well as a QR code on the side that will bring you directly to the page. That we have all of your individual profiles, as well as the full report and a data file with additional resources available for your review. I do want to give a brief update on the Pinal County greenhouse gas emissions inventory for you guys today. Maricopa County Air Quality Department is extremely excited to be working with Pinal County to develop their first countywide comprehensive community greenhouse gas emissions inventory in order to expand everyone's understanding of the greenhouse gas emissions within Arizona as a whole. The Pinal County greenhouse gas emissions inventory will be conducted using the same set of source categories, data sources, and calculation methods that I just reviewed for you for the Maricopa County greenhouse gas emissions inventory. And it will provide everybody in this meeting, as well as additional entities, the information about Pinal County as a whole, in addition to the allocation of emissions for the municipalities and unincorporated areas for that region. We are currently well underway in our conduction of this greenhouse gas emissions inventory. We have the data pulled and reviewed, and several of the source categories have had their emissions calculations completed. They're currently under internal review for accuracy and additional resource pooling for our sources for once we bring this to Pinal County for publication. We are still waiting on some surveys and some data to be provided, but we anticipate those calculations to be completed relatively soon. We're very excited about the value and use that we see for both the Maricopa County and the Pinal County greenhouse gas emissions inventories. And we just want to emphasize that this is public information, and we would absolutely love to see it used in all of your emissions reductions efforts. We know that there are a lot of grant programs that are either currently active or are currently being developed that can benefit from an understanding of local or county-wide carbon footprints. And so we just want to emphasize that programs that are currently being developed, we highly encourage this information to be used to focus efforts or to provide application data support for grants that are being applied for. And for programs that are currently in existence, we encourage you to use this information wherever relevant to evaluate your program's efficacy. And we also want to say that this information can be distributed at public forums. It is considered educational information. We encourage you to incorporate this wherever it is relevant. Please add links to your program and department websites as you feel it would be helpful. And please don't hesitate to provide us with any feedback that you have, or let us know how this information is being used so that we can expand accordingly to assist you guys in whatever you guys need with this data. So I am going to go ahead and leave my contact information up for you guys so that if you don't get your questions answered today, or if additional questions come up later, you guys have somebody that you can send those questions to.